Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Leadership Now. Today, good friend of mine, Kerry Brown. Kerry Brown is a strategist and thought leader on the future of work, change management, learning, workforce adoption, talent, organizational development. I've known her for years. Kerry's worked in senior roles at firms such as SAP, Coca-Cola, pretty good brand name, CSR, among others. Nowadays, she's plying her trade and wonderful talents as a leader at Celonis, the world's first commercial process mining company. My friend, where do we start? Good to see you. Last time, maybe we were face to face. We were co-delivering a talk to an audience of thousands, I'm sure. But let's catch up on future of work, first of all. Here we are, I hope, even though I have COVID today, entering into a post-pandemic world. Do we have a plan for future of work? Like where's your take right now where the organization and its leaders are at, and sort of we'll start there.
Do we have a plan? Well, if there's a plan A and a plan B and a plan C, I think we're on, much further on in the alphabet in terms of the plan.
Okay.
Somewhere STUV or V1, V2.
Yeah.
In terms of a plan, I'd say a couple of things. The future of work is more than just where we work. So the future of work as a topic grew like 6-7 years ago. And really my interpretation and globally the interpretation of it looks at how does work happen? So it's where you work for sure, but it's also, is it robots or machine learning or AI? And how does work continually change where technology intersects with people and work? So I think the plan is ever changing and has been and continues to be stretched and pushed and poked by supply chain issues, by talent demand, by flexibility demand for employees for where they work. So in terms of the people of where you work, I would say that we're in the, it's like when you move house, you move, you decide to move, you move in and you go, I don't really like it quite how it is. And you move things around a bit and change the couch or rearrange the kitchen.
Yeah.
I think we're in the renovation mode. We've moved in, when we all moved out very rapidly from where we worked to somewhere else, we got comfortable and spent a couple of years doing one pattern. Now we've moved back to somewhere else and are figuring out what that commuting rhythm looks like, what the right Goldilocks sweet spot is for time together, time not together, given, I think, some parameters and boundaries that are requiring a flexibility model that every employee is expecting, because the human reckoning around what I want, what I don't want, what's necessary, the rules of, do I have to be together? Well, we all manage to work, unless we're a frontline worker or a manufacturing job. Many of us change where we worked. So we know that we don't have to be together all the time, but we also know that we kind of want to be together some of the time. So I would say that we're figuring that out on the where we live front. I would also say the other pieces of future work have become equally amplified. The volume of demographics changes. Like if you and I, frankly, the last time you and I were talking together live, there were a whole lot more boomers working. And they've the mass exodus of the building, the tsunami, the silver tsunami is tsunamiing. And as there's lingering waves following. And we've got over 50% of the workforce are millennials. Point being, I actually think there's going to be probably as much churn for another 5 years. And my reason for saying that is people, regardless of which bucket of age we're putting them in, people stay still when their kids are between 10 and 18, because their lives start to make sense to stay still. And the oldest millennial is 40. Those who have kids, their kids are not quite in that place where they don't have the flexibility and choice. So I think we're going to see a reasonable amount of churn until you have a critical mass of people who have a critical mass of kids who want to stay still and support their body, their family and their family unit. So from a volume of change around talent, I think that's going to keep shifting. In terms of the other aspects of future work, so AI and machine learning and robotics, equally, when we pulled people or were challenged to have resources in manufacturing, in supply chain, in other spaces, and have been looking at safety considerations or resource availability, that has also stretched and changed. So I think that awareness of technology, anyone who wasn't tech oriented as a business before COVID got tech oriented because you couldn't sit around a meeting room and chat.
Yeah.
You had to have some way to connect on finances, on sales numbers, on whatever you're looking at. So to me, I think we have accelerated everything to do with the future of work rapidly on hyperspeed in the last couple of years, and are getting more comfortable and still stubbing our toe a little bit.
Kerry, do you think, without naming company names, but are you concerned or frightened or alarmed by some of the organizational leader decisions to mandate people back into the office on certain days, as opposed to sort of the autonomy that you're alluding to, where, yes, I mean, I want to give you a hug too. I'd love to hang out and have a face-to-face conversation with you over a drink. But do you see that consternation, I suppose, of the employee rising such that whatever demographic you're in, they're actually going to be haves and have-nots, or i.e. the employee saying, you know what, I do want that flexibility that company X is offering over here. Screw that. I'm going to go work for them.
I do see consternation. I actually, in some of the earlier getting people together conversations around how to navigate through this, one of the questions I asked a number of organizations that had hourly shift workers who needed to be making and doing things together, is how are they dealing with the haves and the have-nots when there was a lot more fear and concern around safety and risk and health of proximity of people.
Yeah.
How were they dealing with the fact that the workers who were the hourly workers, shift workers, laborers, who often were considered by many companies almost as replaceable, versus, the office worker was often given more attention, more money. When you looked at the hourly workers who were office workers versus the hourly workers who were shift workers and need to be together, how are they balancing out some of that in terms of who's really business critical and who's really worth more, if you will? And that, I know, has been a point of pain and a point of attention for a lot of organizations over the last couple of years, and has changed some of the who do we value the most? Like, think of how we've all paid attention to health workers differently.
Yeah.
The other question, though, on where do you need to be? So yes, there's the super obvious Elon Musk, everyone must come back to work, to name a name that everyone hears about in the news. I think that's a bit short-sighted in terms of everyone must all the time be together, because we have learned we don't need to sit in rush hour traffic at the same time. We have learned we can do a lot. What you and I are doing works well like this. It would be great if we were together, but everyone we're sharing this with isn't with us now either. So the reach also grows. So there's wins from some of the flexibility. I would say that I do think that people should have time together when it's purposeful. So when you look at the purpose-driven company or purpose-driven decisions, I think that the purpose-driven time really becomes the intentionality for working on strategy together, working on planning together, doing some social things together that aren't just the hard work, but have developed the relationships so that you have those relationships when you aren't always together. Like, you and I are friends because we spent time together over time, so we can carry that friendship through virtually.
Right.
And so you do need some spontaneous downtime. And that's the thing I think that was lost during COVID is you had to schedule spontaneity. You couldn't walk into somebody in the hallway. So having some fixed time so people can have good, planful, how do I navigate my kids, my life, my workouts, my demands, my life, I think has also become where work-life balance is work-life management, and there's choices around it. So will people change if they don't get what they want where they are? They have been doing that. The great resignation, the great reshuffling is happening. If there's a recession, if there's, will that shrink back? You're certainly seeing some of that right now. Some larger growth activities are slowing in companies. There's definitely a bit of a pause button, like there was at the start of COVID. And then the world, we were on fire in terms of people moving around for COVID. And then everyone stood still. Yeah. And then, the great rush continued, even though we were all virtual. Like, people were being hired into new jobs at mass speed and leaving and going at mass speed, not meeting in person ever. So, I think I think it's short-sighted to require all or nothing. I also think it's really valuable to have some time together to build. And that Goldilocks sweet spot is different by industry, by geography, by size of company, and that the listening piece of that, so, when I was at SAP, Qualtrics did a ton of work at free around the world to listen to employees as they first left, to listen to employees as they were moving around. I think the listening has grown, and the empathy and the awareness, to me, one of the biggest touch points in the space we live in. People were a little bit taken for granted. The line of resources, which is the largest line on a lot of balance sheets.
Yeah.
People were scarcity, the awareness that if you didn't have people, they were sort of taken for granted a little bit. And I think that everyone is thinking more about talent and how it plays and how it contributes.
So we're no longer just a number on a spreadsheet. We're actually human beings that you think we've made the shift, if you will, to the humanity side, where we're actually concerned about the well-being, the nurturing of the human.
I do. I think that no one got a hall pass in the last 2 years. So nice. It wasn't just in a particular geography where it wasn't in your backyard. It wasn't just a particular level. It was everybody. Every person in the world was touched, and that fragility and that vulnerability, I think, gave an empathy and an awareness to people that many had, and many just didn't have as much as they have now. So I do legitimately believe that the attention and focus and the refresher on the importance of people for some, and the not refresher but newfound focus is really present and has had a lingering, lasting effect. I think some people have gone back to normal, like out of sight, out of mind. The problem is not as imminent, but I think en masse, there's a much greater awareness.
Recently, I've been sinking my teeth into research, particularly about the integration of work and life for this next book of mine. And so you brought up work-life balance. And so the question I have for you, Kerry, is what have we learned, I suppose, right, as a result of not just the past 2.5 years of a pandemic, but even prior to that? So, the last maybe 5-7 years of, people are human beings. They have a life. So what does the employer need or ought to be doing to develop, nurture the self, the id, the identity, right, of the human being, of the employee, and vice versa, right? What does the employee need to be doing to fit, inside the work at the organization?
I think it's a two-way street. It's not one or the other. So I agree with you. It's both have to play, like in any relationship. Early in COVID, my coaching and guidance was communicate more. So as a manager, communicate more so the employee isn't unaware and frightened, so that they know what's going on. And as an employee, communicate more so they don't think you're home eating bonbons. Like making sure that everyone is sharing, and where, if you were seeing each other, you could tacitly cover expectations by "I saw you" or whatever else, being overt around that. Next year, what I focused on was provide predictability. So there was so much uncertainty where you could provide some predictability and manage expectations. So you and I have talked about change management for years, big space I play in. If I boil down change management into one sentence, about expectations and accountabilities. So if you have shared expectations and you all know what they are and you all know where to show up for them, it works. Surprises or not showing up for either is where disruption and unhappiness materializes. So what have we learned? I think that we've learned we need to listen more. So to me, as an employer, I think we've learned that if we have good KPIs, good descriptions, good expectation setting, and good accountabilities, responsibility there, we can trust people to do the right things. And we have ways to know that work is happening without seeing it in front of us. So that trust building, the over communicating, the listening, trust building on both sides is really one piece that I think is critical to work-life management, where that flexibility will continue. In terms of developing the id, I would say that people have gotten probably rightfully a little bit more selfish, and needed to be, because the intimacy of COVID was really palpable. We were inside people's homes where we weren't before. We met their children, met their cats, we met their lives. And we used to, there's the TV show, right, that's on TV, or my brain's just gone blank about the name, severance, I think it is, where you separate your brain and you show, at work, you don't remember what you are at home, and at home, you don't remember what you are at work.
Yeah.
We used to bring a persona to work, and we used to have a persona at home, and you might have with friends, and you show up slightly differently in each of those places. Frankly, I think the most comfortable people were their authentic selves everywhere. And when you talk about psychological safety at work, bringing your whole self to work is really what builds that place of trust where your best self can show up. And your best self is also your most vulnerable self, who has a crappy day or a hard day or needs support day. So I think that intimacy has created an acceptance and an insight into the more human side of who we are. So to me, what an employer needs to do is continue to nurture that. We developed, I think, a bit of a kindness and an acceptance of life. And don't forget that. Don't expect to only have the worker back and leave the human behind. As an employee, there is value in coming together. So work is work. It isn't play. Mm-hmm. So at some point, we used to all pretzel our lives to make work happen. And now I think we're a little bit more selfish, but we also need to work. Mm-hmm. And it may be that some of the patterns of what we need to get together, to get lots of people to do things at the same time, requires that coordination, which may not mean that everybody gets what everybody wants every day. So it may be that Tuesdays and Thursdays are what we do, or Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or whatever. And that, we've all developed a very individual rhythm. It's interesting if I think about a lot of people who consulted a lot and were on the road. Their families have like a life when the person's home and a life when they're not.
Yeah, great
and
analogy.
When everyone comes home, you go, oh, you're here. And then they came home and they never left. And so the rhythms were very different. And so when you think about, we've all developed a life where we don't go to work. For those of us who had the privilege to be able to work not in that state. And now we've got to go, okay, well, it's a little bit of both. So I think as an employee, it's, thinking of it like an owner. If I were the owner, what would I want for my company? What would I want for my team? Not just what I want for me. And that balance of respect and trust, I think, is something that, back to the empathy discussion, having empathy as an employee for the employer, and the limitations on finding talent, the limitations on cost management, the challenges to stay in business with weird supply chain issues, all of those things that, businesses went through the same meat grinder of survival that people did. Yeah. So I think that mutual respect and trust is part of what each can contribute to a relationship to make it thrive.
It's like you're alluding to this almost reciprocity of awareness, right? The employee has to be self-aware of not just themselves and who they are and what they're bringing to work, but what work is going through. It's not as if that there isn't the trials and tribulations, as you alluded to, that, whether it's supply chain or otherwise, that the employer had to go through. And then reverse that. Of course, the employer is just made up of people. And then if there's leaders, let's call them that, they're human beings, that so too have to be self-aware of themselves and how they're portraying, them to the employees who are thus doing the work to get, the job done. Right? Fair?
Very, very much so. And yeah. I think that at the start of COVID, there was a good few weeks where I thought, okay, if I lose my job, what will I do? I didn't lose my job. My company made choices that allowed everyone to stay there. That was there. And yes, there were offsets of costs and so forth based on travel and not travel. There were business choices, but it was a privilege to stay fully employed. I know people who went through pay cuts. I know people who went through furloughs, and all the different things. And then it's all redistributed. But how do you have an appreciation for the employment you have that allows you to have the life that you're trying to balance?
Mm-hmm. Very well said. Okay, 2 more questions and we'll let you go. So you and I have worked a lot in the HR space or with HR. Mm-hmm. So what do you think human resources, or better known hopefully these days as people and culture, what tactics do you think they should be employing, Kerry, this day and age to help create what you and I have been chatting about for the last, 20 minutes or so?
Listen, number one, listen more. Don't over survey all the time, because people are also sick of being surveyed.
Yeah.
So I realize that's a very contradictory statement, but getting as personal as you can. If I go back a long way to, like leadership and the 1-minute manager or situational leadership, and the premises where all this started, personal leadership, like who are the people who work for you and what do they need, and recognizing that one size fits all isn't necessary anymore. So getting clear in HR on what does our business need, what does this role need to be successful, what does our team need, what does an organization require, and then leaving the rest to flexibility, where you trust the employee to show up. So designing jobs that are around skills and capabilities, not around years, not around education. There is a massive change of people who are working. I was having this discussion just a couple of days ago with a colleague who is now living heavily in the HR space with HR leaders, and talking about how, for 20 years, the world had a pretty static workforce who you were saying, it's like if you said, I want a house that's south facing, that has a purple bedroom and a galley kitchen, versus saying, I want a house that's going to house 3 people.
Yeah.
And you used to be able to be super specific and say, I want a person who's got exactly this resume, and here's all the perfect criteria. Well, do they really matter to whether or not that person had that right job? No, this is what I need to get done. And so when you look now at the volume of great talent who's in the workforce, who doesn't necessarily have 15 years experience or 12 years experience or 17 years experience with that purple bathroom and galley kitchen, but they have the aptitude and the capability, looking at focusing on the outcomes and the way who can do the job and how the work can get done are outcomes focused versus being limited by her original expectations. So job postings in that regard, obviously all the equality considerations around that thinking about how do you write those job descriptions that they don't preset the notion of either gender or capability or otherwise that would be the right person for that job. That's a little bit of a no-brainer right now, but nonetheless, I'll say it because it does matter. I would say in terms of the shared ownership consideration is, as we continue to evolve to whatever the right Goldilocks sweet spot is, inviting smaller teams to help you. Like you as an HR business partner, or you as an HR person, people culture person, you are part of the culture and you are one of the people, so you have your experience. But inviting in smaller task forces and teams to continually be the voice of and representation of your population around performance management, around what's the work-life balance rules. Having small quorums of teams is a really good tactical way to get an active voice that isn't surveying, where you've got a small group of 3 to 5 to 8, depending on the size of your organization and the numbers of groups you want to represent, and have them be the shared voice where they keep the pulse on the organization and are an active voice to not only the people and culture leaders, but to the business leaders around what's continuing to change. So on a quarterly basis, you reconnect with those groups to say, are we tracking? Do we change? So that you've got that active engagement is another really good tactic to keep everyone connected and not put all the burden on you.
Oh, I love it. Okay. Last question. So you're such a purpose-driven leader and human being. You've done all kinds of things in the community, but also DEIB and gender parity and women's inclusivity points. Like, can you tell me a bit about where you believe we are at, if you will, particularly when it comes to sort of gender parity, gender pay parity, women inclusivity in the organization? What more we need to do?
We need to do more. I'll just start there. We need to do more. I think the collective awareness is greater. I live in Atlanta, Georgia, as you know, and I would say that there's certainly a lot of visibility around race and culture in Atlanta, which is, I think, illuminated. The last couple of years became illuminating for people who weren't necessarily looking. I will say that the silver lining of goodness on what happened with George Floyd is that a lot of people paid attention who weren't necessarily paying attention before. And I ironically think that if COVID weren't happening, we might not have noticed it as much as we did, because everyone was at home and had the same access and volume of attention on something, which that wasn't the first time things like that have happened, but everyone looked at it. Yeah. And you saw the flood of attention in the D&I space, in organizations, in the investment, at a time when many organizations were figuring out how to survive. Yeah. Just business. So it changed the attention to women as well. It's been talked about. There's a lot of conversation right now around and movement towards pay transparency. It's interesting. My personal philosophy on pay for years has been, okay, there's some degree of privacy and dignity related to that for people. But if I were to find out what everyone I work with is paid, I would want to believe that if I saw it, I'd think it was fair. So do I necessarily need to know what everyone gets? No. Would it be interesting? Sure, it'd be interesting. It's like, what are your Christmas presents before you see them? It's always not like a kid, you want to know. Yeah. But I've always wanted to believe that if you saw it, you'd think it was fair. I think that if everyone were to see it, I don't think that everyone would think it was fair. It's currently still true. And so if everyone were to know and you go, well, Dan is worth that because Dan brings the following value and Susie is worth the following and Bob is, if everyone were to have the sensation that the contribution somebody's making is consistent with what they're being provided, then that would be goodness. I think right now, if everyone saw what everyone made, there'd be a bit of a shock. And I don't think we're there yet. And so preparing for and continuing to recognize, if you don't tell, Glassdoor, Fish, there are plenty of other places, Blind, there's lots of places where everyone's sharing. Mm-hmm. Is it all fully accurate? You get to put whatever you want in there, so it's not been validated. We are in an ever technology sharing world, and that will become more visible. So yeah, it's like the 60 minutes rule. Would you want what you're doing to be on 60 Minutes on Sunday night? Would you want all your pay to be shown? What would the reaction be if everyone knew? So I think having a critical eye and being intentional and deliberate around saying, okay, well, if we need to change it, what do we do in the next 1, 2, 3 years? Because you can't magically fix it in a year, but looking at it, thinking about it, committing to it, and not being additive to the problem, I think is also key. Like, it's an interesting, I'll add a thing I've had a thought on, which I haven't talked about a lot. There's a ton of increased pay that came with the Great Resignation and the massive hiring in the last while. I suspect people who are in jobs, if they found out what some of the new people got hired on, would think, did I miss out? Should I be, what would I change? And granted, it's like the housing market, do you buy or sell at the right time? Where were you in the hiring situation, and what's that talent worth? Will there be a settling of housing prices? Will there be a settling of, what happens if there's a recession? Just like we're seeing the changes in the marketplace, what will that do to jobs? So my summary of that is, are we there yet? No. Have we made good strides? Yes. Is it something that isn't a tokenism discussion? Yes. I think it's moved beyond that. But there's still more work to do.
Fantastic. Love your insights as always. So tell us a bit about where you're at, what you're doing at Celonis, and where we can find out more about you.
Absolutely. So I joined Celonis, which, as you shared, is the original process mining. So process mining, if you think of any kind of systems we all use, and you hope, you'd roll them out and cross your fingers and go, I hope they all use it properly. This is the, you go back and look at all the Post-its a month later and go, they're not doing what we thought they were doing. Right. So this is the ability to look at and see how work happens and how to address deviations and all that kind of goodness. So it actually, as much of it seems like a little bit of a detour, it's part of what I've played with. And so it was really exciting. Last week, I was at our world tour in New York, and exciting to see how many customers from SAP, from Oracle, from Salesforce, from all the various places are excited about being able to figure out if the investment they made in technology, which is so significant for many companies, how it works. And it's the kind of visibility that we all have sort of talked about as the Holy Grail, but it's there. And so for me, it was exciting to see that commitment and engagement and enthusiasm. So I am an advisor working with customers on how to navigate through transformation, how to make that stick. Like my litmus test is how do people's jobs change when you do technology or any kind of transformation. So same thing, how do you navigate through this? And thinking about where does AI, machine learning, and robotics fit in? So how do you use, so that process as a spine to look at and see where could AI be used? Where does machine learning make it better? How do you put automatic workflow, all that, how do you play with ServiceNow, or like, how does that all fit together? What's that mosaic that is the right answer for a given company? And I'm curious to see where it goes. So I've been there a little while and get to play with a lot of old friends, and that's been lovely because it's definitely a family.
Well, that's the best you could ask for. That's fantastic, Kerry. So thank you so much for this, for just a wonderful compendium of different facets of insight. Really appreciate it. And can't wait to do the next one with you.
Me too. Thanks today.
All right, everyone. That's Kerry Brown here on Leadership Now. Cheers.